From the Mary River up in the Northern Territory, which is a very good crocodile spot. And the reason I'm referring everything at the moment to the Estuarine crocodile is a kind of a deliberate thing we're doing at the moment, because they're normally called the saltwater crocodile in common parlance. The problem with people calling it the saltwater crocodile is that they think it can't be found in fresh water, and they can. And you might remember last year a 12-year-old Australian girl was taken on a streamer feed river from the Adelaide River because her parents didn't realise that saltwater crocodiles actually swam into fresh water. So we were trying very, very hard to call them estuarine crocodiles to ensure that people understand that these things live both in salt water and in fresh water. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is try and cover these 5 areas. I'm going to explain a little bit why I research crocodiles. I'm going to wear my biologist's hat for a while, and I'll talk about some of the basics of the crocodile biology, distribution. We've got a lovely experiment in Australia, closely followed by Papua New Guinea, where we've had a system of open access use of crocodiles. It was followed by full protection, and in the early 80s in Australia that was followed by sustainable trade. So we've got a nice experiment with different policy regimes with different outcomes. Why I find this interesting from an economics perspective is that right in the early 80s you have an issue that seemed to have a lot of economic dimensions. The recovery of the crocodile is largely an economic one. The fact is, a $50,000 US Hermes handbag buys a lot of conservation. So the economics is actually quite easy to understand, that level. But we actually had very, very little influence on this policy, and as I'm going to try and throw out more at the end, I don't think we have a very good idea of why it actually worked, and we need to get some idea of why it worked, because there are other animals, obviously, that are endangered and could also benefit from these sorts of success. Okay. Oops. All right. So what's my main motivations? Okay. Main motivation is that I bump into all these people who, well, at least in economics, and they all talk about how the elephants did really well in the 1980s under sort of community management-based schemes. And that's all very exciting, but that was almost 30 years ago. It's getting a bit dated as an example, and it's also not a really good example because the whole thing's crashed and burned. At the moment, elephants are being poached at even higher levels than in the 1980s. So it's not really a clear-cut example where economic incentives have worked. Conversely, we've had lots of examples with crocodilians. There are 22 different species of crocodilians on this planet in the 1970s. 2/3 of them were recognised as threatened or endangered, and now only 1/3 are. So to take a group of animals and go from having 2/3 endangered to 1/3 is a remarkable conservation achievement. There is no other group that we have done that with. If we had done that with birds, people would be singing from the rooftops. If we had done that with whales, people would be dancing in the streets. If we had done this with large cats, people would be out there cheering. We did it with crocodiles and nobody cares, nobody knows. But it's actually a really good example, and it's a better example, perhaps, of economics in action than the Adelaide River is up in Darwin. Okay. Now, the second motivation is economic factors are very important, but we don't seem to understand them very well. And the reason, and that's costly, because we don't seem to know how to apply those lessons to other groups of animals, to have that remarkable recovery with the crocodilians. It would be fantastic if we could do this with other animals, other endangered species. So we really need to get some kind of handle on why this actually worked. The third reason is for about 2 years I've been playing in the tiger black market in China, and that's a very, very depressing story. And I would like to talk about something positive this time round, and that is the recovery of our crocodilians. And not only is it a conservation success story, it is also a development success story. It is something that has had big development impacts on a lot of countries. And it's been quite a good economic outcome as well. So, any questions? Just let loose. All right. So what's the problem? That's the problem. See all those teeth? Okay. Problem with crocodilians is people don't like crocodiles. Not really. See that teeth there is growing back. So sorry, if you actually look at the original photos, you can actually see there are lots of little pores and the scales which used to excrete the salt the estuarine crocodile does. So basically its problem is it's a very big carnivore. It is a very, very big carnivore. This is a big, big animal. And it is not afraid at all about taking people. As far as it is concerned, we are lower on the food chain. We are merely a slow pink food group. It has no fear of people. This is unlike tigers. This is unlike lions. This is unlike bears or wolves. Crocodiles don't learn to be wary of people because they're too dumb and we are too slow. So, that's the problem. How do you save something that big and nasty? So it's not. Why? Because they're really cool. And these are all photos that I have taken up in various places. You can also, if you're vaguely interested, you can see that big plate there that blocks the throat when it's grabbed prey. So it stops the water ripping down into its mouth. Okay, so what do we know about this? Okay, the problem with the estuarine crocodile is that it's not just a big crocodile. It is the biggest crocodile. It is bigger than the Nile crocodile. Anybody who has read one of those scholastic books on how to tell alligators from crocodiles, and alligators are larger than crocodiles, it's a lie. Or it's actually a very American perspective, because what they're doing is they're comparing that American alligator to the American crocodile. This is the biggest. This grows 5 to 7 metres long, weighs a tonne, covered in armour. Will quite happily swim out into the ocean to catch sharks. Okay. And most attacks on people are an explosion of water and then nothing. Modus operandi, sort of grab you, teeth are that long, that's going to hold you fairly well, drags you to the bottom of the river, and then you have a contest to see who can hold the breath the longest. Crocodile can manage it for a couple of hours. All right, so lives in salt and fresh water. Big, it's dangerous. Its range is restricted to the tropics, so the southernmost range is northern Australia. And that's because it's a poikilotherm, it's cold-blooded, so its metabolic rate depends on temperature. And that's important because it means you can't go down further into Queensland or around Western Australia because it gets too cold. So if it eats, then the metabolic rate is slowed down, the food in its gut rots, and it dies of food poisoning. So there's kind of a strict limit how far it can go. So only two crocodilians that can survive in cooler temperatures, that's the American alligator and the Chinese alligator. So by our standards, Louisiana is a cold place. And very big populations, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and you do find it ranging all the way across to India. So very, very tropical. And as you've already worked out, it attacks people, it attacks livestock. You weigh a tonne. You're 7 metres long, you've got a jawline like broken glass. What is there to be afraid of?
habituated to salt water?
They'll swim between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and they make the circuit around. We don't really know, because once they're out in the open ocean, they're pretty hard to follow. There are radio trackers have been used since the late 70s to try and track movements, but we've still only got a very imperfect picture. There's a lot of their behaviour in freshwater we still don't understand, even now after 30 years of research.
What's the start? Like, are we talking 10,000, 1,000, 100,000?
What are we talking about?
The start of crocodile hunting.
We don't know.
Oh, okay, well,
Yeah.
yes.
Um,
Well, you get it.
The estimate of the pre-war population is between 60 to 80,000 animals. Looks like it's getting probably to that, maybe above. Louisiana has a lot more. Louisiana, yeah, I'll talk about that later maybe. Okay, so the point is, people don't like crocodiles. And there are good reasons why people don't like crocodiles. So what happened? Well, originally, stage one, Australian management system is open access. And we all know what happens under open access. You get over-harvest. Because what crocodiles also do is they produce very, very high-quality leather, which is used in the luxury leather industry. So what happened is Australia said after World War II, let's shoot a lot of them. Actually, they were still shooting them before World War II. Do you know a New Zealand economist by the name of Bill Phillips? Have you heard of Phillips? He was a crocodile hunter in northern Queensland at one stage of his varied career. So he is, I think, one of a small group of Kiwis who've been up around there. Okay, so they're being shot for their skins, and they're also basically being shot by farmers and everybody else because they kill livestock and children and that sort of thing. And there are no breaks, because we think about it, all you need is a small boat and a gun. That's the minimum requirement to hunt crocodiles. It's a very easy entry. And also, because it was a pest, you lose one of those economic breaks. You know, in fisheries, once the fish stocks are uneconomic to fish, people stop. Okay. Not with crocodiles. You keep going because of their pest status. They have a negative value in that sense. So I don't think there's anything at all unpredictable about this. There is absolutely no way you can have any cost effects to limit harvest. So the population really, really hammered. And that's an incredibly low level to begin with. So no surprises. This is just a classic open access problem. Okay. Next. All right. Then across the 3 northern states in Australia, they put in full protection for the crocodile. Now this was actually quite easy, because basically you're going around to all of these people saying, you know those crocodiles that don't live in this river? Yep. All those non-existent crocodiles you have, they're all fully protected. And the people said, well, we're okay with that. Protecting fictional and non-real crocodiles doesn't have any real consequences. So nobody really cared, and even, in fact, hunters were one of the drivers behind trying to get protection put in for these animals. Despite that, there was still Aboriginal harvest of crocodiles. They like to find where the female has the nest, so they kill the female for meat and consume the eggs. Slightly differently in Papua New Guinea, which they were basically using after independence hunting controls. They're after a certain belly width, which is fairly easily monitored. The belly width at between 18 and 51 centimetres. The area of the crocodile that's actually used for the leather is just stomach.
The 51 centimetres, was that to protect the large one?
Because crocodiles take about 30 years to reach sexual maturity. So what you're doing there is you're making sure that you are keeping your reproductive stock going. And this is, of course, making sure that enough young ones are coming through to keep plenishing things. And Papua New Guinea has a lot more costs of harvest than Australia as well. All right, so everything's going very nicely. The crocodiles are being allowed to run free and rebuild up numbers during the 1970s. And then suddenly we started to get an increase in attacks on people and livestock. So numbers were building up. Crocodiles went back to the rivers they'd been exterminated from and started doing what large crocodiles do best. So, problem really though is nobody's doing any counting of crocodiles. So we actually have no good information that are... Sorry?
Well, on the previous slide, it said that like 5% of their pre-war levels, so...
That's a post hoc estimate. So it's an estimate Graham Webb made based on his modelling after several decades of research. So it's not a monitored number. It's sure. There, yeah. But a lot of the sampling is has big lags attached to it. You've got to do a lot of it to build up a solid picture. And seriously, in the 1970s, there was nothing going on. So it's a pretty dead period for collecting data.
Brendon, can I just ask a question? You said that they had been exterminated from certain locations.
Yeah.
And obviously had either moved or were living in other locations. But, I mean, at some kind of optimal level, isn't 0 a nice number to have in certain locations?
Yes.
And this protection thing didn't look like it's location specific. It sort of says,
yes,
here's the 3 big states or whatever, they're all protected, as opposed, and so then...
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they still have 0 population in Darwin Harbour. You know, the optimal number of crocodiles in Darwin is 0. That's what they aim for. But I mean, the point is nobody really cared because there weren't any crocodiles. So passing a law to protect a whole bunch of crocodiles that weren't there, I mean, why would anyone care? Because there hadn't been any crocodiles in some of those rivers for years. So the idea of our risks had been sort of changed. All right, so we've got this problem. Crocodiles are coming back. They're coming back faster than anybody expected. And attacking people. In 1979, there were 5 fatal attacks in the Northern Territory, including one of an American tourist, which is unusual because the usual food for the saltwater crocodile is drunken Australian locals, not tourists. Okay, so why don't we get much data? You'd think a 5 to 7 metre carnivore might be a little hard to miss. Well, basically, they are really, really hard to find. So this is part of a crocodile I got up in the Merri River. My favourite shots, you can see it's hiding amongst some lily pads there. Nice.
For a swim?
Oh, no.
Presume you had a zoom lens.
No, I'm using a 300mm prime on a boat. The trick is when you photograph crocodiles, it's got to be a team effort because someone's got to look out for the crocodiles while the other person does the actual photography. So the usual routine is you sort of taking the shots and then someone says, I can see a 4-metre crocodile. 4-metre crocodile has seen us. 4-metre crocodile has disappeared. Okay, back. It's the ones you can't see that are the killers. And this is all this is water that's very rich in tannins because it's coming in from swamp. So the visibility is practically 0. You know, just a few centimetres below the water surface and you can see nothing. So that's one issue. There you go. That's the sort of habitat you're trying to count them in. That there are in that picture, but you can't see them. No. Idea of the sort of thing that you're looking for. So basically, they're not very cooperative at knowing where they are. And in fact, this whole slide here from the Mary River, this is a patch of water where we have counted 200 crocodiles in a 300-metre stretch, and each of those crocodiles is 3 metres or longer in size. So they're actually very, very difficult to count.
So in a 300-metre stretch, you counted 200 crocs.
Yeah.
That are 3 meters long.
Yeah. It's
Just putting them in. Doesn't fit.
yeah.
Tagging something as you're counting? 'Cause
It's mostly the proof technique is based spotlight at night. So you get on a boat at night time because they're more active at night time. Because of course,
yeah, how do you know if it's not the crocodile is trying to have as many crocodiles ago?
there is always some risk of overlap, but you need fairly good people to do the counting. Also, because they're territorial, they don't tend to move into each other's range. Unless they're bigger than the one they're moving into, in which case it will only be one crocodile. But essentially, you're talking very remote areas, which are difficult to get to, very murky waters, and let's also, let's be realistic. It's probably not the safest job in the world to be out there counting crocodiles. You don't get many volunteers.
The natural food would be fish out of the ocean?
Everything. This is a river system, so birds, wallabies. There's a suspicion that wallabies might actually grow this big if it weren't for everything killing and eating them. There's a lot of this is also an area that's high in fish as well, so there's a lot of fish being eaten. And as a side effect, you get lots of fishing eagles also, which is good. So if you want to get fishing eagle photos, this is also the place to go. Okay, and if you might remember that shot where I showed you a bit of the head. That's kind of the head there. So this is to give you some idea of actually how big that animal is under the water. And I've added a bonus dragonfly over there. Okay. So one of the kind of the freakiest things is actually watching this animal dive, because it weighs hundreds and hundreds of kilograms. And it has this technique of diving under the water. And you're going, yeah, this is a big animal. I can see it's a big animal. It is bigger than the boat I am in. It's a big animal. You see it dive, and the water flows over the bumps and scuts on its back. And the second it is underwater, there is nothing. There is not a ripple. There is not a bubble. It is gone completely. And it should not be possible to push that much mass underwater and not leave some evidence it's there. So generally, it's the ones you don't see that are the problem, not the ones you do see. Hence, when the 4-metre crocodile disappears, that's our cue for moving out of harm's way.
Was they attacked the boat?
Sorry?
Was they attacked the boat?
They have been known to attack boats. Generally, they don't, because they figure that boats are even bigger than they are, and they're worried about dealing with big crocodiles. But and we kind of know what we're doing as well, which is a good thing to do. I don't recommend anybody else just goes and launches the boats in. Okay, we're not doing a lot of economics, are we? All right, so it's the policy dilemma in the early 80s. What do? To maintain protection, which is what the conservationists wanted to do we cull the wild populations way back down, which is what the locals wanted to do? Or do we use some economic incentives to make them valuable? So there's this whole debate going on in 1980, 81, 82, right up to when this population was downlisted to Appendix to CITES. We've got something that's going on about trade, we've got development angles, all sorts of really interesting economic aspects. And economists are nowhere to be found. And one of the reasons we had a lot of disagreement was this policy we were adopting was completely novel for Australia. It wasn't novel for other parts. In Zimbabwe, they had already pioneered the practice of ranching crocodiles using economic incentives. Australia, this was quite novel, and because nobody had actually been counting crocodiles for a decade, the data was actually too poor to even work out if that was necessary. And this is still significant. We don't actually know a lot about how crocodiles, the estuarine, moves around the freshwater systems. So that led to frictions, high level of disagreements. Essentially, the federal scientists and the scientists in the Northern Territory had a fairly major bust-up over what was happening. The federal scientists were saying, we haven't collected enough data, we don't think the recovery has occurred. People up in Darwin were saying these non-existent crocodiles are starting to kill and eat people. Can you explain that? And even if we did look at where we had tried crocodile farming, there's an experiment up in northern Queensland, this was a complete economic failure. This had been started in 1972 as a way of generating income for an Aboriginal community. It's a simple way of exploiting a local endowment. And almost a bit over 60% of the land in the Northern Territory is Aboriginal land. So a lot of the crocodiles live with them. But this experiment here had been a complete failure. So basically, nobody could agree on anything.
Excuse me, when you say financial failure, that's kind of aggregate. It sounds like at 50,000 a purse like that,
Yeah.
from a piece of skin that's on one critter that you can go out and shoot, and if you're poor, that's a lot of money. I mean, like the financial incentive seems to be pretty high.
Yeah. But the root problem here is actually quite simple. First, this was being run by the government on behalf of the Aborigines. So having bureaucrats run this place was not... Once it was privatised, no problem. Second thing is it's in the wrong location. You have to be close to a large supply of cheap protein to run a crocodile farm or ranch. So
they moved here to Brisbane.
Basically what they did is instead of doing the farming, they actually shifted to collecting the eggs, hatching them, and then selling the hatchlings to farms further south. And that's very, very entrepreneurial and very, very lucrative. Okay, so basically the problem we're at the moment is we've got a fairly intense conflict which has been played out. It took 2 attempts to get the crocodile population downlisted to Appendix 2, where it could be traded internationally. And all of this is based on essentially no real data. We don't know what's actually happening to the population. We have no idea if this is going to work. And we have no way of resolving any of these issues. Stage 3, ranching. Ranching is when you remove the eggs from the wild, put them on a farm, hatch the eggs, add chickens at that end, and have this come out 3 years later. And the advantage of porosis is of all the crocodilians which are harvested, this is the premium leather product. Porosis gets the highest price premium because the belly has the fewest number of osteoderms, little bony plates in the skin that would otherwise armour the animal. You can see the bony plates at the top. This crocodile has almost none on the belly, so it's a very high quality product.
So did they breed them to get the eggs, or did they go out and get them?
They go out and get the eggs.
That's more efficient than breeding them for eggs.
Yes. Because, one, you have to feed the adult crocodile. And the farm. Feeding an animal that's almost weighs a tonne is not easy. 2, you have to wait 30 years for it to be sexually mature before you can start breeding off it. And that's not a good economic gamble. Much easier to go and collect them from the wild, bring them to the farm, 3 years later, sell them. So it's basically a system where you take chickens at one end and just 3 years later. It's a cute pair of T-straps or a nice handbag.
Animal protection and legalisation of trade animal vaccines, is that all federal jurisdiction?
Sorry?
It's all federal in Australia? Or do the states have?
This is all federal. So the Northern Territory comes up with a management plan, but the federal government has to approve that management plan. Yeah.
So what restricts access to collecting eggs?
Um,
Do it, or
In theory, anyone can do it, but because this is often found on communal land, that is. And the other thing is, in theory, anybody could do it, but do you have the skill set to go into that swamp, find a nest, get past the female, which may be 5 metres long, get those eggs and bring them back safely?
figure out the cost of shooting into the river? I understand. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. We took a 60 Minutes reporter out into this area a few years ago when they were looking at this whole system, and he was doing I'll tell the story later, but basically he was scared shitless. All right, so egg production, just some basic stats. Each egg gets a royalty paid on it. By the late 1990s, they were about $10 an egg. And recently, prices for eggs have soared because Zimbabwe has kind of collapsed, and that was one of the big competitors because Zimbabwe produced a lot of Nile crocodile. And that's why Hermes has been not increasing its business operations in Australia to try and boost production there. So the connection is that to have eggs, you need nests. To have nests, you need two things. You need adult crocodiles and you need nesting sites. So you need to change the habitat and you need to protect the big adults. Accompanying that was public sector interventions. So one of I think the elements to the story is actually there's a lot of supportive public policy. So the government in the Northern Territory did a lot of education campaigns on how to live with crocodiles, and what to do. And when you had problem crocodiles, they would sort of relocate them. And one of the ways you sort of relocate them is you put one of these traps out for the crocodile, and it sort of goes in and you can remove it. So normally the bait goes on the inside, not the outside. And this is the sort of thing that causes people to wince in horror. You remember my remark about drunken locals being the main staple.
That's the bait for the drunken locals.
Sorry?
That's the bait for the drunken locals.
Oh, yeah. So this is not something you should do. A 5 metre crocodile would be several times the height of that person body lengthwise, and she would slip down without that choking. So, when you see these kind of traps, it's a good sign not to do this sort of thing. But they got into the local newspaper because the shots were sent in. All right, so what sort of recovery have we got? What we're getting is basically an exponential recovery of almost 5 to 7% per year in these areas. The area that we're sampling, so this is just a sampling in the Mary River, where at the moment you can sort of see that sort of things are really taking off quite quickly. And most measures where we have sampled consistently and regularly, we're getting these increases in population.
Exponential,
No, we're starting to hit asymptotes at this point in time. And it also depends on what you're doing. This is hatchlings. Sorry, non-hatchlings. Yeah. One of your problems with crocodiles is the biggest producer of hatchlings is adult crocodiles, and the biggest predator of hatchlings is adult crocodiles, which has made the whole modelling exercise really, really hard. When the biggest producer is also the biggest predator, and a lot depends on the data. So that's from the Mary. If you look at the Adelaide, the Daly, the Alligator Creeks, we're getting these sorts of increases in size and number. And compared to what people can show me of elephant recoveries, that's nothing. That's a real recovery. What else we got? This is Papua New Guinea up in the Sepik River. This is using nesting sites in sort of 2 locations. So one of the great things about an Appendix 2 listing in CITES is it mandates that the government has to monitor the population somehow, so we get data. Worst thing about CITES is being on Appendix 1 because there's no monitoring, so we have no idea what's happening. And if you're interested in property rights, here's a comparison between some villages where the rights to the nests are secure versus some villages where the rights to the nests are disputed. Papua New Guinea has followed this ranching experiment. So this is just, sorry.
Just a question. Are you aware of any kind of political move to make it so that governments do have to monitor the animals that are on the Appendix 1 so that they can know when to pick them up?
No, it's very hard because it suits the political agenda of many NGOs not to have that, because in order to move something from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2, you have to have population data to show that this has succeeded. And if you have no baseline information, you can never show it will succeed. So if you are building your philosophy on anti-trade, anti-use, you don't want Appendix 1 data being collected, because that gives a baseline where you can show something has changed.
Appendix 1 more endangered.
No.
Less endangered?
No. Appendix 1 means all commercial trade is banned. Appendix 2 means trade is permitted under permits. So it is the extinction threat posed by the trade, not the overall extinction threat that matters. So
1 versus 2 more related to repugnance. People don't mind handbags made out of crocodiles, but made out of fluffy furry things they eat more.
There are definite sort of preferences towards charismatic animals in the NGO community. And that's, I think, part of the story behind the crocodiles is nobody actually cared if it worked or not. If it worked and you had more crocodiles, yeah, good. If it failed and you had less crocodiles, yeah, good. And, it's kind of no real challenge to sell. All right, recovery. What about the regulations? Poaching has really come under control in PNG and Australia. One of the reasons is wild skins cannot compete against farm skins. Hermes will not buy a wild skin. Hermes will not buy a wild skin because they want the best leather possible. And in the wild, crocodiles are in the habit of crawling over rocks and branches and getting into fights, and the leather gets marked. And once the leather is marked, its value falls. The wild, I'm guessing, we actually catch crocodiles and sort of look at the belly plates closely. You can often see sort of parasites living under those scales as well. So all of these reduce the value of those scales. So the problem is Hermes just isn't going to buy this stuff. It doesn't matter. It might be cost you the cost of a bullet to shoot a wild crocodile and try and sell it into the industry, but it is of such low quality, nobody's going to buy it. So the economic incentive there is non-existent. Papua New Guinea, there's only one firm that does ranching, Mainland Holdings in Lae. It collects about 10,000 eggs a year, and it entirely self-regulates. So it goes down the Sepik River in Bell helicopters, and it goes to each village and says, we will buy your eggs off you, and you will get cash right then and there, so that the villagers are standing there and these keener notes are being waved under their nose, and they're going, yeah, avarice, great, I want this now. And the rule is quite simple. They can take half the eggs from each nest. Each nest on the river that they can find is geotagged and has white tape added to it, and later they're monitored. And the rule is, if anybody in the village breaks the rule of taking half the eggs. Nobody in the village gets anything, and mainland just goes up to the next village. And it's a credible threat because the people who do the monitoring also explain the rules. So these are people who get dropped out of helicopters onto nests on a river. So what you do is you have two nests, helicopter drops one person at one nest with a rake, flies to another nest, drops another person with the rake, and then goes back and picks up the first person, who at that point in time is just by himself with a bunch of female crocodiles sitting on a crocodile nest counting the number of eggs. So these guys also have more scar tissue than most people. And you get these little villages and these big guys with these scars on their hands and their faces saying, "These are the rules." And the little villagers are going, oh yeah, don't piss them off. We'll follow the rules. So this is what I kind of mean by credible threats. And it also gets you some really great stories to drink beer over in the evenings about crocodiles leaping onto helicopters and fighting these things. All right. Development impacts. It's been really, really impressive. I mean, if you look at the Aboriginal communities, they are really, really badly done by economically. So this is one data point I've got. $190,000 in one collecting season just from their eggs. By incubating the eggs and selling the hatchlings, they managed to push their revenue up from $8,000 to $78,000. So it has a lot of big development impacts in Australia and in Papua New Guinea. People can earn real money producing stuff that people want. And in some ways it's also very fair because a lot of the crocodile attacks you're going to read about in Australia or Papua New Guinea are going to be of locals in these areas. So they do. It's often the children as well because crocodiles like small prey. So that's why they advise you in Australia, when you are cleaning a fish, you do not lean down on the edge of the river to clean your fish because it makes you look small and the smell of the fish guts is going to bring the crocodile to you. So get away from the river, basically. So children are heavily predated. Okay. Problem. Can we explain it with the property rights model? I think we can, but in the early 80s we couldn't really because all we're doing is privatising the eggs and juveniles. And only the eggs and juveniles we can catch. Wild animals, all those adult crocodiles are still fully protected, so they're still sitting in the public domain. Habitat, we've got a mixture of ownership types. The actual export trade still going to be regulated through CITES. So you've got all sorts of these interventions. So in effect, for most of the life cycle, you've got an animal that lives 80 years. So we're taking just a little bit away. So a tiny segment of that life cycle. Most of the habitat, most of the targeted population, because what we're actually after is more wild crocodiles. So that's a conservation outcome we want. Most of it we haven't done any privatisation. Most of that's still in other domains, still fully partitioned. So in the early 80s, we really just couldn't look at it and go, that's a property rights solution. Because people would say, well, habitat's still public or communal, and wild animals you're trying to target, they're still public domain, and the whole trade's done through CITES, and that's public domain. Optimal extinction. How am I going for time? Do you, has anybody heard of optimal extinction models before? Standard bioeconomic work by Colin Clark in the early 1970s, where you may know through a lot of fisheries and whaling stuff, and Timothy May, which you may know as a very high prominent scientist. What they basically do is they look at the intrinsic rate population increases and compare that to the financial return on an asset. And what it basically says is if something's got a very low rate of growth, then you're better off killing all the animals, selling the products, and putting the money in the bank. Because if something's growing at 3% in the wild, and you can make 5% in the bank, kill them all, make money in the bank. And one of these, this is kind of important, employs a logistic or Schaefer growth function, which gives you a nice sigmoid growth function for the population. And that's very, very highly regarded in the conservation community. And of course, we knew that crocodiles bred slowly because it took them 30 years to reach sexual maturity. So they had to breed slowly. Problems really were that these models assume that people are really, really stupid, that they will not manipulate reproductive rates or death rates or habitat parameters. So what you're automatically doing is saying you're not going to take them out of the wild where the eggs have a 90% mortality rate just through flooding and put them into a ranch, because that would change the death rate, and you can't do that according to this model. The model says people are too stupid to do this. So what we found with ranching is the opposite. Obviously, we are manipulating the reproductive and survivorship rates up quite a lot, and people are now starting to fence off riverbanks to increase the number of nesting sites. So we've changed the habitat. Also says that wildlife has one value. It's only the commercial value. Harvest it. Look at ranching. Well, not only do we have the leather, but we've also got the meat, and we've got the tourism, and there are sort of cultural values, Aboriginal communities attached, and all these other things. The other great thing about the Schaefer function is there's no age structure. And what we're doing here is we're deliberately exploiting the age structure. We're shifting harvest from adults, which live forever, to eggs and juveniles, which have mortality rates of 90–95%. Production costs are negligible. They have to be, otherwise you can't liquidate your population. Here, you've got big constraints. One of them is there's only so many eggs you can put into a ranch. Mainland holdings in Lae has capacity for about 10,000 eggs. So it doesn't matter. They can't do more than that because there's no room to sustain that. So we've got two economic models, property rights and optimal extinction, and they're really completely incapable of telling us which direction to go. Wildlife farming, practically nothing has been published since Bulty and Damiana in 2007. And hey, same thing, logistic population growth, so there's no age or sex structure to the population, only one product. Presume often a market structure that's never verified or tested. And the kind of thing is when we look at wildlife, is prices aren't homogeneous. This is from Papua New Guinea. This is Goliath butterflies. This is a birdwing ornithopteran. It's the largest birdwing butterfly on the planet. So I've got about 1,300 data points for this year. And you can see the price ranges from 0 to 30. Why? Quality variation. The wings are damaged, it's worth nothing. So the higher the quality of the wings, the better the colours. All of these things matter. And this is, in effect, how wildlife farming works. Wildlife farming works because you don't care about this end. You don't care about the higher costs because you're operating at that end. You're going for the higher prices, the higher quality, and that means you can take on the higher production costs. Quantity. So this person here collected something like 30-odd Goliath butterfly butterflies. Most of them are just collect one or two. These people only ever collect one, get nothing back, don't continue. I don't have an analogous data for crocodilians, but this is true of every data set I've got on insects from Papua New Guinea. The basic problem is there's no quality control with wildlife. You can control quality in silviculture. You can control quality on a farm. You can't control quality in the wild. You can't get your animals not fighting. They're going to do that. So that's an important dimension to this whole recovery. People said you can't farm crocodiles, you can't ranch them because it's just cheaper to shoot them. Well, it might be cheaper to shoot them, but when you're getting very, very low returns, and the Hermes are buying for the top product, it doesn't work. This is a good way of illustrating different markets. This is the price per foot of an alligator in Louisiana. They harvest about 30,000 wild alligators a year in Louisiana, and about 300,000 eggs are collected each year in Louisiana. Basically, the prices are different because they're going to different markets. And one of the best predictor of how much wild skins get produced is the blue line. It's the number of tags issued by the federal authorities. This is basically harvest levels being driven by what the government says you can harvest, not what anything else says. And that's the effect of Cyclone Katrina in the last period. Okay, can we explain it? I think there are political economy explanations. I think we're talking now about the early 80s. And while you have NGOs very worried about whales, and NGOs very worried about tigers and elephants, nobody was worried about crocodiles. This has been their curse and their blessing. So there were no NGO opposition to this. Since then, growth of the internet and a few other factors have really pushed NGO involvement in conservation, where it is now very, very hard to get these novel trade mechanisms used. For example, Northern Territory has cannot get safari hunting approved. They shoot 500 nuisance crocodiles a year. They want to allocate 25 of those to safari hunters. Recipients would often be Aboriginal communities who would get revenue from those hunting. The idea has been blocked by Steve Irwin, by a group of NGOs, and the federal government won't allow it. And when you think about it, this means absolutely no change at all. There will still be 500 saltwater crocodiles killed as nuisances. There's no conservation effects. There is only a welfare effect. The general argument here used is the wonderful point that if tourists don't want to come to the Northern Territory if there's safari hunting because it sends the wrong message. And 6 weeks after they made that decision, they announced the Northern Territory would be used as a place to put nuclear waste. So apparently tourists are not deterred by nuclear waste. But the idea that someone might be shooting large nuisance crocodiles, which to my mind is actually a real positive, is going to be wrong.
Has tourism fallen? Is that
No. It's all posturing. All right, so the political economy really helped, and that also helped with the fact that nobody really cares about crocodiles. Now, I've come from tigers, and this is a mess. Crocodiles, you can do anything you want with crocodiles. Nobody really cares. There's no ethical dilemmas. People don't get worried about people farming crocodiles. That, I think, also meant regulatory authorities weren't being pulled in any lobbying direction. So I think that the timing and the lack of charisma are part of the explanation. There's a political economy reason for this. The other things I'm intrigued about is what actually happened. Nobody predicted. We go back to the early 80s and we have this proposal to do ranching of crocodiles. And we have an outcome that nobody got right. The opposition said it would simply increase poaching and laundering of animals, and harvest would soar to unsustainable levels. And the advocates were just talking about skins. And we can do this through skins. But what we actually had happen was some divergence. We had the meat industry develop fairly soon afterwards, because you're raising these crocodiles, turning them into handbags, basically killing them at 3 years of age. Handbags happens in France or Japan, and people noticing that the tail fillets were going to waste. So, bit of entrepreneurial activity, we go, yeah, we could market these, and they got a lot of food-type people up from the south to come and sample the crocodile dishes they had, because people weren't keen on crocodile. It's a reptile. People don't tend to eat reptiles, and it's a carnivore, and people have a thing about carnivores. You're allowed to eat cows, but not these sorts of things. They had this kind of sort of function organised for foodie people. You know, magazine editors and chefs brought them all up to the Northern Territory, up to Darwin. And sort of periodically they'd go around at the marquee and tasting these dishes and go, gosh, this tastes just like chicken. And the reason was they didn't have quite enough crocodile meat to prepare all the dishes that they needed. So they ended up cutting some chicken meat into the crocodile meat in order to make it bigger. Never mind. Worked wonderfully. It's a very entrepreneurial, very Australian type thing to do. So the meat industry took off. But again, nobody expected that. And you might say, well, yeah, you could probably work that one out. I mean, meat going to waste. It wouldn't take long for people to put 2 and 2 together. But the tourism, completely out of expectations. Because, for decades, people have thought these are horrible man-killing monsters. And then the ranches were starting up, and people were coming and going, yeah, can we come and have a look? So now we've actually got a plethora of tourism ventures being organised around crocodiles. You can go up the Adelaide River on a boat and do a croc tour, and they'll dangle some meat over for the croc, and the croc will jump out of the water and go ooh-ah and take pictures. And well, if you want to do something a little more heroic, you can follow where I went to. But yeah, there are those sorts of...
Sorry, when you talk about the tourism, it was an unexpected kind of extra revenue source.
Yeah.
Are these things specifically an unexpected revenue source from all these ranches, or just there's been an interesting tourist to see them in the wild, which has got nothing
Both.
to do with ranching?
Both. They started by going, can we see them in the ranches? Which is really important because Queensland does not permit ranching. Queensland requires farming. You have to have adult stock. And the only way the Queensland farms stay afloat is because of the tourism revenue that is also brought in.
When did Steve Irwin show that?
Don't know.
That caused a completely independent surge in demand to go into crocodiles?
I doubt it, because the Steve Irwin message was that this was a terrible, cruel, horrible thing to be doing, that the head of the crocodile specialist group in the IUCN was a nasty man like Hitler, which he did say. And Steve knew a lot less about crocodiles than most people realised. He was an
That may well have been his message, but I never heard that. I just thought, oh wow, there's crocodiles on TV all the time now.
Right. Okay.
So maybe I want to go and see a crocodile.
Okay. I don't know. I think the tourism thing had already started in the early 90s. He may have been a catalyst for an expansion, but it had started.
Because people started being interested.
Yeah. Or he could have exploited that interest into. I don't know. Yeah. Steve wasn't the most popular person. Okay. But the point about the whole tourism thing is it was just like out of the blue. Nobody expected it. But lots of things started connecting, and there are now Adam Britton runs sort of Archosaurus in Darwin itself, but you can get into a tank, a big glass thing around you, and go underwater and look at these big crocodiles right next to you.
Actually, it's probably a parallel with tourism, like where I live.
Yeah.
And lots of whales out in the south. And when they had one in net on the wharf, there was just hundreds and hundreds of people every day seeing that whale. And then out of that grew one going up into the wild and seeing it.
Okay.
So it's not, and it's probably completely independent, but it's probably a parallel sample.
Sure. Kind of the point I'm trying to say is we've got it's almost a discovery process going on. You sort of open options up, and suddenly people are discovering new ways to do things, and new ways to connect crocodiles to development, to economics. And I think that's part of the mystery of what happened here. Meat unexpected, tourism unexpected. What was also unexpected is that the local people up in the north would start to treat crocodiles as iconic animals. In other words, they were becoming more like sort of kiwis and eagles and things and less of a pest. There was a shift in public attitudes as well. So there's something, I think, maybe in the whole literature of entrepreneurship, discovery there that could be tapped in as part of this explanation of what made this work. Another element is just the knowledge. See, I think a lot of people knew things that just weren't useful or applicable. Aborigines knew long before anybody else did that nesting is determined by dominance. So the dominant female lays the first nest, and the next dominant one lays down, and you just go down like that. And if there's not enough nesting sites, the ones who aren't dominant don't get to lay their eggs. The Aborigines had worked this out a long time ago because all you had to do was find a nest, you killed the female for the meat, and because that made taking the eggs much easier, and you took the eggs and then it was replaced by another crocodile. So there were a lot of things that people knew. People knew about sort of the restaurant industry, or people knew about the tourism industry, but none of this was really relevant until this whole front was opened up, where you could suddenly start using these sorts of information. Whereas perhaps the problem is the conservationists are getting really caught up on collecting this explicit information. What is happening to the population? What is the returns? What are the numbers? What's the data? And what's really driving it was actually people trying things out. The first program of harvest was very scientifically designed. It was just a matter of, let's take all the eggs from this river and see what happens. I don't think we'd ever get away with that in New Zealand. And basically, because you can't find all the nests, there's always some that survive. So it did actually work quite well. But people had sort of, perhaps sort of inklings of ideas of what could be done and were able to try them out. So this shift to a market-based system may have had a lot to do with sort of opening up scope for entrepreneurial and discovery of these solutions, rather than just being a straight, this is a property rights solution. I think it's also very hard to have any explanation that doesn't also take into account the regulatory authorities, who have been very, very supportive of a lot of these programs. Papua New Guinea, the support is high because this makes a lot of money for PNG. Australia had a lot of high-level support for these programs as well, and a lot of that was just basically, letting you get on with it. You want to try something else? We'll let you do it. All they're really doing is some oversight on the population and making sure that the CITES permits are being met. All right, so I'll just sort of close with two final things. Perhaps there is a more sophisticated and generalizable property rights explanation. That could be explored, and that would be useful because we could then apply those sorts of insights to other problems where we face similar issues. The last one I'm sceptical about because I've tried to do this and it doesn't become very tractable because once you start factoring in the regulatory authorities, multiple products, heterogeneous prices, and that the whole bioeconomic model is real nasty because of that whole predation-reproduction problem. You know, all you really get is some very, very big equation which says it all depends. But I'm perhaps not a very good neoclassical economist. So people do have insights. I'm quite happy to hear them. And we quote at that point there. Female crocodile. You can tell the ones in the wild because the teeth are stained. You've probably got a better idea now of the pores which extrude the salt. And you can tell it lives under the mud as much as possible. And she was on the Adelaide River. Okay. You had your hand up first, but I'm...
At the beginning, your motivation was, this has been this remarkable success. No one saw it coming, or the things you could learn from this, hopefully to help some other animals. And I was just wondering, there were a couple of things in your story of what happened that seemed to me they may be a bit unusual, or maybe it won't be so helpful to other animals. And one was that you said that there are huge barriers to get the eggs that are being harvested. It's very dangerous. It's usually on these Aboriginal communally held lands, so not anyone can go in. You also said that there's a monopsony buyer. The eggs, which can keep the price down, which makes it more profitable for the ranchers?
They tend to actually try and increase the payment to the harvesters because that keeps them collecting. You don't want collectors dropping out. So I don't know. You've also got a long supply chain because once they're actually harvested, then the skins are sent to be processed into leather in Japan, Singapore, or Europe because nobody has managed to duplicate those skills in the range states. And after it's converted into leather, it's then sent on to another point in the supply chain, the luxury manufacturers who then convert it into something else. I'm just not sure that we've got a nice, neat neoclassical monopsony.
Wasn't your PNG example of that?
That yes, but that is one. Yeah, one.
I mean, because you think of each little village having their own helicopter and selling directly to whatever markets they're on. But is that the kind of thing you're looking for, Jim?
I'm just wondering if part of what made the ranch so successful
was
this monopsony buyer.
It could be. I think there is something with the market structure because, of course, it does all sorts of things. It puts an absolute physical limit on how many eggs you can take because you can't just keep taking egg after egg because then there's nowhere to put them.
Reasonable control over nesting site, whether organized communal property following kind of Ostrom stuff or private ownership of the site, you're going to have incentives that if everybody else is over harvesting, you're going to try and make better habitat for more nesting sites for your area.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a little more of that and a little less of the monopsony stuff.
Yeah. I mean, because we don't have a monopsony in Australia, and you don't have to just sell the eggs in Papua New Guinea, but you can also hunt crocodiles and sell the skins. But the mainland is large enough that it's basically a price leader, so whatever prices it gets offered tends to be the prices that permeate the crocodile industry there. Sorry, who was hand up?
I understand the story you said. First of all, there's no incentive to harvest, there's no incentive to shoot. The numbers are practically made extinct.
Yeah.
Then all killing of crocodiles was banned.
Yeah.
And the numbers recovered enough that children started getting eaten again.
Yeah, and livestock and tourists.
And then this harvesting was come in and numbers really shot up after that.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a puzzle because in the wild it continued to be banned. It was only the ranching that it was allowed. So I can understand the half of the puzzle, which is how do these incentives make a difference, since the incentives were over here and the actual numbers were over here where the door hadn't changed. What I'm not getting is, what will the actual behavioural change
Nesting sites.
would have caused the numbers to increase?
Nesting sites. So farmers before would have illegally cleared the crocodiles out because Northern Territory, only about 3% of the area is reserved. The rest is outside that system. So previously they would have done very little to discourage poaching. They would have probably illegally killed them anyway, and they would have let their stock run over the nesting sites.
Okay, in that case,
So then,
isn't that a classic gives them property rights and economic incentives and illegal poaching act?
sorry.
It's there. I mean, you put that. This is a bit of a puzzle because you didn't actually change the law.
I think the puzzle is, I think you can look at lots of reasons why it worked, but it's a patchwork of reasons why it worked. There isn't a really coherent, generalisable explanation. What you're basically doing with the economic incentives is you're encouraging a increase in nesting sites and you're discouraging illegal take. But you're doing it through a connection through a couple of shifts to those eggs. So that biological aspect is well understood, and but you then have to ask, okay, it worked really well in Papua New Guinea. It's worked really well in Australia. That's really encouraging because, if it works in Papua New Guinea, it can work anywhere. But when we go to Thailand, it's a disaster. Crocodile ranches and farms there aren't working, exacerbating the loss in the wild. So there's...
Is there a difference in access rates to nesting sites?
Problem is they're still taking the wild animals out of the rivers to put them into the farms to increase. So in Thailand, it's a lot more. You've got a corruption angle. I don't quite understand why Thailand doesn't work. Sorry, I don't.
Is it a different species of crocodile?
It is a different
They
species.
grow more quickly, so you can breed them in captivity. So then you want to take them. The adults out to breed them where you got them, rather than raising them up 30 years.
It's a different species. I don't know, but I mean, just simply creating those economic incentives it's not obviously a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition to generate these outcomes.
The land where the nesting sites are, is that communally owned? Is it individually owned?
It's communally owned.
Okay, then you look at other kinds of communal goods if they're better produced in Australia or Papua New Guinea than they are there.
Yeah.
Look at sort of ostrich stuff.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I'm quite happy to go with a good property rights explanation here.
I'd
Be
like
nice.
to see if there are other collective action problems that tend to be well solved in the kinds of communities that also solve the crocodile
Right.
problem and tend to be poorly solved in the kinds of places also and not to solve the crocodile problem. If that holds, then that's solved it. If not, then
Move on to it.
puzzle.
Yeah.
Is the use of the crocodile eggs change over time? Like, I didn't quite get that story. Like, but before when we had problems, like the stocks were vanishing, did they take the eggs or just
No,
throw them?
they just shot the wild crocodiles.
And so is the story that somehow this ranching was invented and that
Yeah.
the eggs became valuable
Yes.
on their own, and also because you get a better product.
Yes. So you
because
can.
You don't want to have wild animals anymore. And
Yeah.
But then this is still a puzzle. How do we get the puzzle is how do we keep the eggs, half the eggs in the nest. That's the puzzle.
No, the puzzle is, I think, first of all, in the 80s, we had no idea why it was going to work. But now we know it's worked. But there is seems to be a lot of things that contributed to that success, and working out what it is that is essential and what we can apply to other cases is the puzzle.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry.
a mystery about what the puzzle. Is the puzzle the actual recovery of?
No, that's the event. We know there's an event.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a number of things that could explain that recovery. One is that property rights explanation. We've got a straightforward biological explanation in terms of shifting the harvest from low mortality cohorts to high mortality cohorts, and that works well with lots of other cases. We've got a biological explanation. Yeah, so that you've got these connections, and we also have, I think, a very strong political economy explanation that does not seem to be easily duplicatable in other species. That people don't care what you do. So,
I would have thought, rather than saying puzzle or competing explanation,
right.
the explanation is that property rights in allowing a return change the behaviour that was needed in order to do it. The question then is, that was necessary.
Yes.
That was the cause. What other things did you need to have in place
To
to facilitate that, to make it work? And are they unique to crocodiles in Australia, or would you be able to reproduce those in other?
yeah.
So I mean, I guess it's just the word puzzle we
Sure.
found.
That's right. I mean, I have a general problem. I don't get to talk to people a lot about this. Ergo, I'm sort of throwing it open because.
Because the recovery of the crocodile takes to be a period for like
It's it started, but the question is, could we sustain it and get it back up to a level that was a natural? I mean, it's the objective in conservation is not just to get a recovery in numbers; it's to get it up to a point where it's now ecologically where we need it to be. Having more crocodiles is good, but we need. Yeah, sure.
I think you're talking to people in my country, they don't have any big predators. So I grew up in Canada, and bears and wolves and coyotes are my little guys when I was growing up.
Yep, good.
And I think there is something that's different about this species. Is that next to great whites, they're probably the ultimate predator left. Up to the way you describe them, they're terrifying sort of things. And so I would have thought that the optimal thing was zero. I'm with Laura, and that's where things were going until the quote property rights regime was changed. The political economy thing was like, oh, there aren't any of these things around. Somebody got through this protection order. Then these guys start coming back. And I think there is something. What do you do in general? I mean, there are tigers, there are wolves, there are coyotes, there are bears. Like in Canada, they're wild things. They're not even. There's the ranching thing as well, which you can put them in zoos if you like. But I think there's a story here that comes through that risk. So, for example, it may be you can get $50K for a bag like this. You lose my daughter or my son and I at a local park because I happen to be cleaning a fish, and it's like, well, gee, who's responsible for that? You know? Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking zero is a good number if I'm living in the Darwin area. So what I'm thinking is that there's a story in terms of normally with private goods or public goods. With public goods, you've got Sam's conditions, willingness to pay, optimal level, and stuff like that. But here you have a clear case where for many people they're willing to pay heavily to have risk reduced from eating a product by accident. Okay? And there are others who would like to do what they're in here, and it's that meeting that comes into the property rights thing. Who bears the risks of these? And that isn't taken care of. But I think that the story of the crocodile is really interesting because there are these, for example, in Vancouver, they now allow coyotes in the urban area. Wild coyotes have been reintroduced, or I guess wolves in national parks now in the States. And it's like, well, wait a second, here's a story about how real predators deal with real people in those things. And there's obviously some blend because it was going down to zero. The legislation changed, it's popping up, but I'm sure it's not right. I mean, the people who are dying are saying, no, I'm on zero. Who bears the cost of those?
Well, when you know, right, you get place where they're harvesting the eggs from. That's where the people get eaten anyways, and they have the residual claimants on the value of the eggs. So if they wanted to, they could go smash all the eggs, and nobody would really be able to tell the difference.
Didn't it?
Yeah.
That's because, for example, when
Well,
you
it's
said
illegal, but
and when you said
You can't police it.
a nuisance kill, are you allowed to carry a gun with you and shoot a croc?
Yes.
Because you do that with wild animals in Canada.
Yeah, and this is what I think I was saying to Richard before he disappeared, that one of the great merits of working with crocodiles over students is if crocodiles do annoy you, you're allowed to shoot them.
So that's part of the proper shooting.
Yeah. No, there's always the right to self-defense, but generally
You don't have a chance.
no, this was the whole point about the 60 Minutes reporter. Took him out to show him how to get eggs. And he was looking very covetously at, he was getting very nervous. We'd give him an oar to carry. And he was going, what do I do with the oar? What do I do with the oar? And we were going, well, don't worry. If a crocodile comes at you, you'll know what to do. And he was sort of coming up to these nests, and he was going, gosh, I hope these crocodiles aren't anywhere near us. Well, probably female at about 5 metres of us. For an animal that grows to 5 metres, he wasn't being very reassured at that point in time. He was looking then covetously at Graham's 44 Magnum and going, okay, I've got an oar, you've got a gun. What's that all about? And so Graham turns around and gives an evil look and says, well, if a crocodile does get you, the gun's for you. But when we sort of got back, and I was sort of congratulating him on how well he was feigning fear for the camera and sort of playing up. And he was going,